Page 156, Age of Revolutions by Zakaria. The 1896 realignment. By the time Bryan secured the Democratic nomination for the 1896 presidential election, the chief debate in American politics was about economic policy. Hammering the same themes from his Cross of Gold speech, Bryan campaigned against the corruption of urban industrialists and the inequality facing rural farmers. While he still retained components of the Democrats' old coalition, including white supremacists in the South, he shifted the focus away from the racial attachments that once held the party together. Instead, his populist campaign was largely about resisting the unequal effects of industrialization. The Democrats, who had once vehemently opposed centralized state power, now began to realize that government intervention was the surest way to support those left behind by technological progress. This impulse to use the government to alleviate market inequalities would become central to the modern Democratic Party. As Bryan established the Democrats as the critics of the industrial titans, his opponent in the presidential race, William McKinley, secured the Republicans as the champions of big business. Although Republicans had earlier wanted the government to invest in science and infrastructure on behalf of business, this changed with the 1896 election. When McKinley won the presidency, Republicans grew more skeptical of government meddling. Meanwhile, as the 20th century dawned, the source of capital for industrialization was moving from the public to the private sector, namely through the business empires of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Ford. Lobbied by these magnates, Republicans argued that government intervention hindered technological progress and economic growth. The GOP had once favored centralized government authority, but now it embraced an anti-status posture with laissez-faire economics at its core. This realignment still retained distinctly American features. In the South, the Democratic Party saw the rise of populists as a great danger to white rule. The movement threatened to unite poor blacks and whites into a coalition that would find a common enemy in the Southern landowners, and so the party set about breaking up that nascent alliance by playing up racial animus. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Lyndon Johnson, who had allied with white supremacists early in his career before embracing civil rights, recalled this divide and conquer tactic. If you could convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. The year 1896 marked not only the crucial Bryan versus McKinley presidential race, but also the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, which enshrined separate but equal racial segregation as constitutional. In the years following the decision, the South's Jim Crow system expanded, stopping black Americans not only from voting, but also from eating at the same restaurants, staying at the same inns, and using the same bathrooms as whites. If black and white people were prevented from mingling, perhaps they would also be prevented from finding common economic political ground. Segregation is what Palestine and Israel is doing right now. Still, battles over the rights of black people had been fading since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, as both parties accepted growing racial discrimination and focused instead on the crucial question of government intervention in the economy. Social issues were swept under the rug, thus perpetuating white supremacy. This bipartisan bargain was symbolized by photographs taken in 1913 on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, in which aged Union and Confederate veterans were shown shaking hands, old divides forgotten. The American political system was now defined by the same economic cleavages that existed elsewhere. The Democrats began to cohesively identify as the party skeptical of business and the Republicans as the party of free markets. The last progressive Republican. There was one important exception to the stark division between left and right: McKinley's Republican successor, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was no radical, but he broke decisively with the laissez-faire ideology of his party. Much like conservatives in Britain before that country's political realignment, he sought to curb the excesses of capitalism. His square deal program of consumer protection, union support, and antitrust measures battled robber barons and their monopolization of industries. When I say I believe in a square deal, I do not mean to give every man the best hand, Roosevelt explained. All I mean is that there should be no crookedness in dealing. The president did not seek to hinder economic growth so long as everyone played by the rules. There seemed to him no greater offense than the arrogance of the new elites, in his words, the wealthy criminal class who obfuscated their unethical business practices behind the free market. Roosevelt himself was born into a stupendously wealthy family that owned vast estates on Long Island, but he drew a clear distinction between his type of genuine aristocracy and the vulgar imitators, the robber barons of his time. Teddy Roosevelt's aristocratic heritage imbued him with a certain noblesse oblige that contrasted with the new titans of Manhattan's Millionaires' Row, with their ostentatious displays of wealth, underhanded manipulations of the market, and evident disregard for the public good. In many ways, Teddy Roosevelt resembled a European aristocrat dismayed by the hustling and unethical behavior of the nouveau rich businessmen suddenly dominating society. Among the old New York elite that the Roosevelt family embodied, there was a collective understanding that one's privileged status brought with it a moral responsibility toward the public. Many in this class recognized the disruptive nature of capitalism and the need for the government to help the masses. Though Teddy Roosevelt had been McKinley's running mate against William Jennings Bryan in 1900, once McKinley's assassination thrust Teddy Roosevelt into the presidency, he in many ways took up the populist cause to crack down on big business. Roosevelt famously embarked on a program of trust busting, marshaling the power of the federal government to break up monopolies that had been taking advantage of the little guy. Even Milton Friedman said that capitalism can make all the profits at once, but no fraud, and no monopolies. When a coal strike threatened he got Congress to expand the government's regulatory authority over industries ranging from railroads to food. When a coal strike threatened a frigid winter for the nation, he intervened to reach an equitable arrangement between labor and capital. Instead of breaking the strike as President Grover Cleveland had done in the Pullman strike of 1894. Fundamentally, Roosevelt believed in capitalism, but he saw the government as a policeman of the free market. Though his successor, William Howard Taft, would carry on some elements of his program, namely trust busting, Taft was cozier with big business, and Roosevelt would regret picking him as a successor. The divide between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft mirrored a broader rift in the Republican Party between economic conservatives and progressives, one that came to a head in 1909 over the issue of tariffs. Progressives within the GOP thought that import duties had gotten far too high, raising prices for ordinary consumers while serving the interest of big business, a similar argument to the one the Anti-Corn Law League had made in Britain. Conservative Republicans, however, proceeded to pass the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which raised tariffs on certain goods even further. Though a supporter of free trade, Taft signed the bill and progressive Republicans revolted. They contended that the bill prioritized business over the common man. When Taft proceeded to clinch the Republican nomination in 1912, this solidified the GOP as the firmly pro-business party. The progressive Republicans defected, and with Roosevelt creating the Progressive Party and running as a third-party candidate, the cleavage between Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft ultimately handed the election to Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who ran on a progressive economic platform closer to Teddy Roosevelt's. Many progressive Republicans flocked to the Democratic Party, which solidified itself as the party of redistribution and regulation, leaving ardent pro-business types in the Republican ranks. America's party realignment was finally complete. The coming century of American life would be largely defined by political warfare between the right, championing laissez-faire dynamism, and the left, championing Social Security and stability. There was little room for Roosevelt's central synthesis. Thus saith the Lord, thanks be to God. Amen.